Hi, it's my pleasure to be here today with Voice Global, where we will be discussing how technology can transform and scale to solve real business problems, and how voice is part of that transformation. I am Marcia Tal, the CEO of Tal Solutions and the founder of Positivity Tech, a SaaS platform that combines human insights and advanced technologies to uncover and enable strategic growth opportunities that are hidden inside of your customers' conversations. The exponential growth that's happening today in the applications of voice technology, coupled with the unprecedented expansion of digital transformation across all industries, and the data that is associated with these technological solutions, sets us on the path to global scaling and unimaginable business growth, which is the best way for me to introduce my colleague and my friend, Betty DeVita. Betty is a global executive with expertise in digital transformation and consumer financial services. Betty is currently the Chief Business Officer and member of the board for FinConnecta, a technology company which connects digital platforms and solutions and financial service companies via an API platform to accelerate digital transformation and open banking. Betty is also the founder of BetDev Solutions, a fintech advisory practice where she works with emerging companies on strategy, value creation, partnerships, and the path to global scaling. Previously, Betty served as the Chief Commercial Officer of Digital Payments and Labs for MasterCard, and prior to that, Betty held various leadership positions at Citi, which is where we work together. Welcome, Betty.
Thank you.
Betty, as a first question, I'm certain our audiences would be interested in your perspective of the digital transformation that's taking place today in financial services. We'd love to hear, what are you seeing in the market, and what business problems are being solved with these continuously evolving technologies?
That's a loaded question, and I'll try and answer at a couple of kind of macro levels, and then try and get a bit into what we're seeing in different regions around the world. I mean, at the macro level, it's clear that financial institutions can't continue to develop everything here, right? The notion of proprietary development is just, it's not sustainable from the standpoint of the speed and velocity by which they need to turn around new solutions. They've got a competitive landscape of thousands of fintechs and startups that are entering the market and providing services at a level that consumers and SMEs and corporates see in their everyday transactions. And so there's so much friction that's been taken out of the equation with many of the digital giants and these new solutions. Banks can't continue to transact and provide services in the way that they had. And technology at a broader level is moving from on-premises legacy type of technology to cloud computing. And all of this kind of is wrapped around looking at capital expenditure versus operating expenditure and pay as you go. So there's just so many forces that are driving it. At the consumer level, at the SME level, it's really around, and the pandemic, I think, added to that with regard to this requirement not to do face-to-face and high-touch solutions. If I could order with one tap and one step with DoorDash and Amazon, why and how can I do that with my financial institution? So just a few of the driving forces that are driving this enormous wave of digital transformation in the marketplace.
That's wonderful. That I think the way in which you phrased all of that, I'd like to add just a couple of points with all of what you just said. Behind the scenes and all that is all this information. There's all this
data.
And yes. And so with every advancement in technology solutions, there's a set of new data that is behind it. And the use of all of this new data, the linkage of all of this new data, is really one of the untapped resources that the enterprises have to identify new revenue and growth opportunities. So on the one hand, we have all of these applications and we have technologies, and on the other hand, we're getting an asset, right? We're getting increased data from all of these interconnected systems and capabilities that now institutions have an opportunity and also have a challenge to figure out how to use. So with that being said, I kind of wanted to talk for a minute about voice. Since we're here on this Voice Global platform, it would be interesting to hear from your perspective how financial institutions are thinking about voice assistants and how they're using those.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a variety of ways, and I'm glad you brought up this the piece on data, because I think there's such such a view at the financial institution level, as well as the regulatory level, as well as the consumer level, on who and how you take that asset and safeguard it. There's privacy regulation, there's open banking regulation, and I know we'll get more into that. And I think those are just such giant pieces of content to be able to deep dive into. As we look at voice, and particularly at FinConnecto, where I spend a lot of my time from a portfolio standpoint, you can equate it to, again, an experience that a consumer has using their iPhone with Siri, or some of the other voice assistants that are out there. Banks are starting to look at chatbots and then voice assistants to be able to drive some of the more routine, and incorporating that with AI in the tech stack to be able to drive some of these 60-80% of the routine transactions that will enable consumers and SMEs to self-direct their service and to minimize the cost and wait time and requirement to come into a branch in order to be able to do some of these transactions. So it's very much an offload strategy, as well as an opportunity to really serve consumers in a way that they had not been able to do, because they're bringing in incremental data about trying to understand perhaps what next best action is for the consumer. And so if you combine voice as a service strategy, and you add into it the artificial intelligence and the machine learning associated with what the potential service scenarios and sales, and surprising the consumer with information that they can assess according to family profile, and data that has been permissioned. And I think that's one of the keys back to this data piece. If it has been permissioned by the customer, then there's just a slew of opportunity to be able to use it both on what I would call offense and defense, to deliver a better consumer experience, and to really get to the heart of some pain points. And I know, Marcia, you do a ton of extraordinary work trying to actually discern, how do I understand what some of these pain points are from consumers and not only resolve it, but get to what I would call next best action.
Thank you for that, Betty. And I want to build upon what you said, in fact, because also, like you said, there was so much in there. Um, the first thing when you were starting to talk about customer experiences, yes, I think about voice as these customer conversations. And I think, in fact, that there's a whole discipline around conversational design. How do we speak as humans? And then how do we replicate that so that we can really get to solve some of the examples that you just said? In my work, for example, I see more of the complex issues. So that's why I'm using, for example, artificial intelligence to drive and extract kind of the meaning behind the conversations, while the technology can take care of, at least at the first cut, the more simple transactions. Let me give you an example. I was just thinking about this the other day. I had come across a consumer frustration, right? A consumer complaint, and it was rooted in points of discrimination. And when you listened to what the customer was saying, in this particular case, the customer was deaf, and they had called in to speak with an agent. And the agent didn't realize that the customer was deaf, and they were using a relay service. And I think that they thought that this was a fraud. And so I thought to myself, if a person is having this difficulty discerning, for example, kind of what's happening with this person and their disability at this point, how is a machine going to do that? That's kind of a much higher order that we're going to have to get to as we learn through all of the science behind conversations and conversational design. And so I still think right now, with all the advancement that's going on with voice technology, with all of the thousands of developers that are working on all of these solutions, it's still nascent when we want to bring it into these types of complex issues that institutions have to deal with on a daily basis. And the point that and we're going to get into open banking and open data, but the permission is a really big deal. And what I see in my work is that either customers are going to be so happy that, of course, they want to give permission because they'll get more, right, from that, or they're so frustrated that they don't care anymore, right? And they're giving permission as well because they're thinking that by making public what it is that's happening, it's going to help them. So we've now kind of unraveled, right, what's going on from institutions, financial institutions specifically, as they're engaging with bots and voice assistants and technologies, these kind of bigger problems that still today humans are solving in their direct interaction with consumers, and what type of tools and capabilities can we advance to connect these things together. So it made me think of a lot of things. I know that was kind of like a long response.
No, I think in the service industry, as they, as financial institutions over the many years when you and I were both at Citi, there was always a drive to try and move towards an omni-channel approach to both service and kind of relationship management, and to provide multiple options for customers in terms of how they self selected to what their mode of transaction servicing was. And the notion, and I think the financial institutions always believed that as they started to make new technologies and new channels available, that some channels would completely be eliminated. And I think sometimes they saw that sometimes actually they continued to move forward and have incremental volume across multiple channels, because consumers are not, heterogeneous. So they actually will self-select. And I think that the idea of, all boats rising and other interactions from a technology perspective providing the best in class standard is, again, to my point, driving some of these lack of options that the financial institutions have in order to be able to up their game and be able to provide for consumers of all types, with disabilities, without disabilities. So the interaction with the deaf customer perhaps would be with a chatbot where they could actually be typing, as opposed to the voice assistant or the personed customer service, if you will. And I think we've always talked about the marketing to one or servicing to one. I think the individualization is one where artificial intelligence, just like humans, have to actually be taught what these interactions are by specific segments. And that is not something, to your point on it being nascent, that is not something that happens overnight. I think that the voice assistants have evolved over time. They've gotten better. It's next generation, but they're not perfect. I think the chatbots are doing a reasonable job, but again, they're not perfect and are not able to answer all types of questions where you get directed to another channel. And I think it's an extraordinary time to see how this will continue to evolve and how some of the new entrants, the startups, the fintechs, as well as the digital players and the collaboration that they're doing with some of the legacy financial institutions, try and really move the industry forward en masse. I just think it's just an incredible time to see kind of where we all land, 2022, 2023. And as I referenced before, I think the pandemic really put a fire underneath of the industry to move it forward, because there were no options with regard to how you had to be able to interact with your customers on such basic needs with regard to their financial services.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of follow-up thoughts there. You talked about omni-channel. You talked about voice assistants getting better, not perfect. The same with bots. Humans are not perfect also, right? And so there's a lot of variability in all of these channels. And I think that, as you say, it's an incredible time to have the opportunity to kind of look across and be able to, in many ways, optimize, right? What will be best for consumers if you have information that by imparting that you can help them in that self-selection process. Because I think your answer around the example that we gave is perfect, right? That person would have been better off typing than using the service. So I think that's just a great conversation. I think that additionally, we started to talk about open banking and open data, and I know that you're spending a lot of time in this space. So I think the audience would really enjoy learning more about even what is open banking, the whole idea behind open banking, open data, the challenges that are being faced, and why this is such a breakthrough.
It's an interesting piece of I guess started as regulation in the UK with PSD2, where the regulators wanted to ensure that the financial institutions were protecting the consumer data and providing a way for consumers to permission and for the banks to, especially in the payment space, have a way to share data that was, again, consumer consented using APIs, and kind of putting everyone, both the financial institutions and the new entrants, the startups, the digital banks, the challenger banks, there are so many different names for them, on a level playing field, so that competition would drive the market and that consumers would ultimately be the owners of their data and financial institutions, while having a fiduciary responsibility, um, had to ensure that they were safeguarding this incredible asset. And you talked about data before as well. So there's a lot of concepts in here. Um, Much of Europe tried to also and has some regulations with regard to open banking. And that means, from a regulatory standpoint, that banks had to comply with these regulations and ensure that the way that they allowed connectivity to other type of use cases like DoorDash and Mint and Uber was connected using a regulated data stream of information about consumers that said, yes, give my information to, if they were applying for an Uber account or a DoorDash account, you can give my information or get my information and use my credentials from my financial institution because I'm giving you permission to do that. And some in Europe are doing that with regulatory kind of landscape with APIs. In the US, there is no regulation. And we've started to use what they call screen scraping in order to be able to connect all of these consumer demanded applications to your bank. Canada's got some movement in looking at regulation. Brazil is looking at regulation. Australia is looking at regulation. Kenya is looking at regulation. And so, I kind of view open banking, and frankly, we've developed a platform called Open Finance, which is beyond banking, as both an offense and a defense strategy. The defense is when there's regulation and you actually have to comply using these APIs with a framework, and the regulators and the central banks are looking at it. The offense is where banks realize that all of these consumer demanded applications are going to be, they're continuing to proliferate and get more and more usage. And so they need to, the financial institutions, for example, in the US, need to be able to have a policy and a perspective on all of the consumers that are giving approval to the Mints and the Ubers and and the variety of value propositions that are coming out that are off of your phone to get to your credentials in your bank account. And data permissioning and being able to use this data, it's really, really an interesting space, a very sensitive space. And I'm sure you've also noticed that there's all of, as you use these new applications, there's all of these permissions that they're looking for with regard to cookies. Well, cookies are going away as well. And so how will all of these applications track this data on what your preferences are? So there's a whole explosion that's coming in the ad tech and the martech space, as well as open banking with regard to how different entities, challenger banks, neobanks, and new entrants to services like student loans and extraordinary credit cards that are different from the way that a bank would market them. How are they all going to be connected and working in this ecosystem driven by the permission of the consumer, and in some markets by the regulation, but in other markets just based on market practice, if you will?
So I think if I listen to you, right, the ecosystem is changing, and
Very much so.
the players, the roles, much more again, kind of centered upon both innovation and technological capabilities on the one hand, on the other hand, data, and then on the other hand, consumer preferences, right? And so what you have is almost this triangulation, so to speak, between now regulatory bodies that are looking to bring innovation into kind of the industries that they regulate, right? The established institutions, whether it be financial institutions or it could be in other industries as well, such as healthcare, right? And then you've got kind of the newer entrants that are using technology to meet the demands, so to speak, of what we're understanding from consumers and the ability to keep learning, to keep understanding more and more by using the information, the data, the technology, and all of these innovations is really, again, another way to look at the environment that we're in. And I think it's fascinating. And so while we think about and we hear specifically as we think about the technology, the voice technology, you can't just look at voice alone, I think is what we're talking about. Voice is now integrated and integral into all of these other technologies. And that's a great place to be because it really represents a maturation of that channel that now is coming to become more core to a lot of the services and the examples that you gave. So I think that was, really insightful.
I would even bring it to the next level. And, you talk about open banking. I kind of morphed it to open finance because I think it's broader than just banking. And I even look at it as kind of embedded finance, right? And embedded finance is if a consumer is in an experience, there are many players, right? Like an Uber payment as opposed to an Uber taxi ride. Like Uber is, as just as an example, they started in the ride sharing space. They then went into the food delivery space. There's a credit card that you can access with them. And voice could be and is a part of how you start to experience and request and manage all of these experiences across this ecosystem of services that are provided by a variety of players, some financial institutions, others not financial institutions, but with the eyeballs that they own because the consumer is in their app. And so it's a really interesting time. And I think voice as well as other other input schemes are looking at how do they drive a broader vertical and start to append and aggregate and add on services to ensure that they continue to delight, provide incremental revenue streams, delight the consumer, provide incremental revenue streams, and start to look at the experience of what they're providing. And because technology is able to enable these services to be added using these APIs, using open banking technologies, it's no longer your traditional set of competitors. And I think an extraordinary time for the ecosystem to also be collaborating.
I think there's not a better place to end our conversation today, although I know that we could go on for a very long time and I love it. I think the last word that you used in collaborating, I think that's another whole kind of area where, the unlimited growth that's going to be coming ahead of us is through collaboration. It's through partnerships. It's through an understanding that the challenges that we all have are complicated and they can't be solved by one person, institution, entity alone. And that expands to a global market as well. So we both have tons of experiences in understanding kind of the ability to learn from all different markets, right? And ultimately bring that together. And I think that's another remarkable area that we're all going to experience. So with that, I want to thank you, Betty, for joining me here on this discussion around voice, but really a lot broader than voice. I think trying to understand and see the big opportunity of where voice now integrates and connects with everything else as we described it in that ecosystem. So thank you very, very much.
Well, much appreciated, Marcia, for your voice. Always unique and insightful, and great to have the conversation.
Thank you.